Good evening, everybody. Well, the two people that are here, anyway. Hopefully, we'll have a few extras join us. Hopefully, your weekend went well. Mine went incredibly fast. Had two successful speech meets. You'll have to congratulate Connor Utek and the crew on their success at the Logan View meet on Saturday. Our team, which was mostly JV participants, was second in the tournament in the JV division, which was great. So it looks like good. Ariana is right on top of things with our first question. Ariana's asking, Chapter 20, what was the migration to the United States during the Civil War? There were roughly 300,000 people that migrated to the Civil War, or migrated to the United States during the period of the Civil War, and almost exclusively to the North. And so we discussed this in class and how those numbers really impact the Union's ability to conduct the war, how it adds to the force of the Union. Many of the men who migrate to the United States join the Union Army either voluntarily or through the draft. And so about 300,000 new Americans, many of them, looking for the American dream. Keep in mind the Homestead Act is so important with all of this idea of land at low or no cost in the Midwest. States like Iowa and Nebraska and South Dakota, those Midwestern areas are going to be populated by German and Irish immigrants who want that kind of Jeffersonian American experience. Claire, what was the South's reaction to the Panic of 1857? Well, the panic is going to hit the South harder, but that question has been removed from the test. The South is a one-trick pony as far as economy goes. It's a cash crop economy, and when there's economic turmoil, when you don't have a diverse economy, it's going to have a larger impact. So the costs of goods, inflation, going to hit the South harder than it hits the North. Two good questions from the outset. Our test begins with the end of, or just kind of a recap of the impact of the Mexican cession, dividing the nation. We need to be aware that we looked at several different elections through this process, starting with the election of 1848 and the dawn of the Free Soil Party and kind of the end of the Whig Party in 1852. And so keep those things in mind. But let's just talk about politics here for a second. Why did the Free Soil Party embrace free soil? What was the motivation there? Was it a matter of being conscientious about racial equality, or what motivated the Free Soil Party to be opposed to the expansion of slavery? Should be an easy one. I'm hoping everybody's going, yes, I know this. My wife says nobody's doing that. Everybody's going, eh. They disliked African Americans for taking their jobs. Yes, job competition. Absolutely. Very good. Bingo. Good. We're also introduced, or we've become exposed to this idea that whatever governance takes place in any territory, any state, that the people that live there should make the rules, should make the laws. What is the name for that concept that might makes right, or that what the state should act in accordance with the will of the people? My wife says shared governance. That is not the answer. It is popular sovereignty. Very good. This is great. My wife will play the role of unabashed poor student who never paid attention in history class. She'll throw out the first wrong answer, and then you guys will correct her, and she'll learn along with us. Yes, popular sovereignty should be determined by the will of the free citizens of that state. Okay? Now, this is going to be a bit broader issue here, and we want nuanced detail. We want to think about specifics here. The South, very concerned, very touchy, very on edge as we turn towards the beginning of the 1850s. What was the major concern of Southern states about this whole free soil movement? Okay, what was the major concern of the South concerning the free soil movement? And then if you can kind of anticipate where I'm going, what was not a major concern of the South? Contrary to popular belief, what was not a major concern of Southerners in, let's say, 1848, 1852? As California knocks on the door for statehood, what is a major concern of Southerners, Southern lawmakers? Okay. Ariana says slavery and state balance. So which is it, Ariana? Is it that the abolition of slavery, or is it maintaining the state balance? Because I think the popular answer is, the disappearance of slavery. Was slavery going anywhere in 1848, 1852? Connor, you're at like 93% accuracy there, Connor. I mean, yeah, the balance between free and slave states, or the sectional balance, right? Remember, it's not just about slavery. It's about tariffs. It's about transportation. It's about the block of states that support one another in legislation. And so maintaining the state balance so the government representation would be equal between the two sections, Ariana, that's right on the button, is the big thing. So then the question is, were the southern states concerned about an amendment or the abolition of slavery? Were northern states pushing for the abolition of slavery? Were free soilers pushing for the abolition of slavery in border states like Missouri or Kentucky or anywhere? That's a yes or no question. As California comes into the Union, is there any movement to abolish slavery? where it stood. Exactly. Connor, you got it. I mean, there's radical elements of the abolition movement, but there's no major push for the abolition of slavery by any major political group to remove slavery where it existed in established states. Southerners were not concerned about that. The Whig Party isn't pushing for that. Even the Free Soil Party isn't pushing for that. They're looking at new territories and the potential growth of the country to create this open space, kind of like it's sad to say, but a preserve for white male labor, So very good with that, everybody. Okay. As far as the Underground Railroad goes and abolitionist movements, we've done a fair amount of look at those. Hopefully, those will be easy questions for you. But there are a couple of questions over the actions of the Underground Railroad and the impact slaves have on their own liberation, their own freedom, right? What are some of the ways in which African slaves contributed to the cause of the Civil War, contributed to the harassment, we'll say, of the South? And then the other question I'll ask, since I know it takes a while to type responses, so first question is, what are some actions enslaved people took to contribute to the fight against slavery? And then the other question is, true or false? Most former slaves got their emancipation by running away. Yeah, slave rebellions, exactly. I wish we had time to read Nat Turner's Rebellion. Great story of a very unique individual who believes he's got a mission, almost like Moses, to lead slaves out of South Carolina, taking up arms and committing some pretty serious acts of violence. Work slowdowns, probably one of the most common slowdowns and strikes to really slow labor down. White commerce is at the mercy of black slavery for good and bad, and work slowdowns hamper the South's economy. Fearful of rebellion, absolutely. These rebellions were not that common. There was no successful slave rebellion. They responded to rebellions mercilessly, but the fear that black men would come in and commit acts of violence or against white women, white society, meant that Southern men were required to oftentimes stay behind and tend to their plantations, which limits the number of men that can participate in the Confederate armies. Yes, Ariana's response is spot on. Breaking tools, McKenna, absolutely. Damage to equipment. Of course, running away is going to become more common after the Emancipation is issued. And I want to point out right now, one of the practical effects of the Emancipation Proclamation is going to be that 1 in 7 slaves makes an attempt to run for freedom as the Union Union Army approaches. You think about General Sherman in chapter 21, where Sherman's marched to the sea and he's torching cotton fields and destroying plantations along the way. Then we start to see runaways as a consequence of the Emancipation Proclamation. But on the whole, to go to my second question, true or false, most free blacks received their liberty by running away. False. False is the correct answer. Most free blacks received their liberation through self-purchase or through the actions of an owner in voluntary emancipation by an owner. Whether it was because of financial reasons, could no longer afford to maintain an operation with a number of slaves, or guilt of conscience, that was a more common approach to liberation than running away. Next question. Who is the individual that encourages Whigs to support a compromise when it comes to the fugitive slave law? Okay, great orator, one of the more important Whigs of history. And then my other question would be, his counterpart from the South is John C. Calhoun. I want to look at a few things. John C. Calhoun is in this time, 1850 now, as we consider this final great set of compromises. John C. Calhoun, as the advocate of Southern interests, is going to propose a number of reforms, one of them being a reformed fugitive slave law. But what is the impractical proposition Calhoun gives as far as maintaining union? Because all these guys like Webster and Calhoun and Clay are encouraging compromise, those old guard. And Claire, you get the point on this one. It is Daniel Webster. His 7th of March speech is going to encourage Whigs to be conciliatory, meaning sensitive to and accepting of certain Southern propositions like the fugitive slave laws. And we'll talk more about the Fugitive Slave Acts here in a little bit. But John C. Calhoun recommends that what crazy idea for maintaining union and sectional balance between North and South. Right, leave slavery alone in the South, return runaways, which is a big part of the fugitive slave law. I'll just give it to you here because it's kind of one of these briefly referenced yet often forgotten. He had recommended that there be 2 presidents for the United States, one from each section, with a sectional veto, so that all laws going through the United States government had to be supported by both sections of the country. So he proposes that union can be maintained at the expense of some serious compromise. Remember, he also believes that the South, because of the compact theory, has the constitutional right to leave. We've talked about the compact theory that you come in voluntarily, which means you can leave voluntarily. So Calhoun is a big advocate of that. All right, so those are the old guard, which means there must be a new guard, right? We spoke briefly of William Seward, who ends up being Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. And Seward is a new guard. He represents these radical Republicans that believe in emancipation based on what grounds? Okay, this isn't all Republicans. These are radical Republicans. They start to make arguments against slavery based on what grounds? And I'll just remind you that President Zach Taylor at the time, this is Zachary Taylor's era, 1850, he's starting to become influenced by the New Guard and their arguments. Even though he was a Southern sympathizer, he's starting to move away from the idea of compromise on the slavery issue because of arguments made by people like Seward. New Guard arguments are based on what principles? Of course, Taylor dies, right? And brings in Millard Fillmore. And Fillmore is moved by Daniel Webster and his arguments for conciliation, and so signs off on the Compromise of 1850. But what kinds of arguments? This is a radical minority of Republicans are starting to adopt this New Guard mentality when dealing with the slavery question. It's interesting choice of words Ariana uses as far as purge and to purify. You know, the last time we talked about purifying anything was with the Puritans. And that, I think, is a good mnemonic device, at least for this question. The New Guard are starting to make arguments against slavery based on moral grounds. Remember, one of the things that the South is starting to feel is it's being treated as morally inferior to the North. They're tired. They get really tired very quickly of Northerners on their high horse about the immorality of slavery. And even though Southerners turn to the Bible to justify slavery many times, we're starting to now see some political influence by Republicans. And the Republicans are going to start to come around in the Republican Party officially is going to start to come around in the mid 1850s, but the New Guard Whigs like Seward, who will actually run against Lincoln as a candidate for the Republican nomination, are making moral arguments that legislators need to look to God's laws and not to the laws of man to do the right thing. Now that's pretty extreme, but it's starting to get there, and it's going to be further divide between the two sections. All right, since we're on the topic of the Compromise of 1850, let's consider what it did. So we've already referred to the Fugitive Slave Act, and we'll go into depth with the Fugitive Slave Act in a minute, but what else was part of this package of the Compromise of 1850? We need to know about its influence on new territory. We need to know about its influence on Washington, D.C. We need to know about its influence, obviously, on the fugitive slave laws. We need to know about its influence on the sectional balance. Okay, so if people could start addressing one of those things, sectional balance, California, Washington, D.C. Connor says slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., and that is exactly right. And I want to point out, while the trade was banned, slavery was not banned, okay? Simply the trade was outlawed. The ban only applied to buying and selling slaves in Washington, D.C. You could go across the Potomac River, buy and sell slaves all you wanted in Virginia, but not in the city limits of Washington, D.C. But you could, slave owners still could take their slaves into D.C. There were still slave owners in the capital. And so be sure you understand that qualification. California is admitted as a free state. Very good, Claire. Absolutely. And the trade-off is that the New Mexican and Utah territories, the decision of slavery is left to popular sovereignty. Ariana, excellent job. The tougher fugitive slave laws, let's talk about those, okay? What kinds of enforcement, what types of consequences, what types of teeth were put into the fugitive slave laws? Because there were fugitive slave laws already on the books. So remind me of some of the details here in this new set of laws that were going to take place. Okay, as far as law enforcement goes and being bribed with money to catch runaways, there is a board or a panel that's set up to consider a federal, almost like a court, but it's more of a hearing panel that's set up to consider these runaway slaves and whether they're runaways or whether they're free men. And those guys are going to get paid $10 if they find that the person is a slave, and they're going to get paid $5 if they find this person to be a free black man. And so you can imagine what direction that went 99% of the time. There are going to be consequences, legal, criminal punishments for people that help slaves run away. And that's a response to the Underground Railroad and the frustration and fear that caused Southerners. Very good. And it's going to allow, this is the most important one, because imagine what the northern states' reaction to this is going to be. It's going to allow Southerners to go into Northern Territory legally to retrieve their property. Okay, so it ignores states' rights to decide on the matter of capturing and returning slaves to the South. So it pretty much legalizes the bounty hunting trade for the capture and return of fugitive slaves. Now that's going to frustrate, anger Northerners because it's a breach of their states' rights. You know, oftentimes with states' rights, we're talking about the South. But here, you know, when it applies to the North, Northerners are quick to point at the 10th Amendment. And we'll talk more about the 10th here in a little bit. But of all the parts of the fugitive slave laws, the one that frustrates the North the most is this idea that their borders could be infiltrated by people that are able to take slaves southward, regardless of the state's laws. So they're going to react to that. Northern states are going to pass conscientious laws saying that law enforcement doesn't have to assist in the capture of fugitive slaves. In some states are going to deny bounty hunters access to jails or public resources that would make catching slaves easier. So we're getting to the election of 1852. And it's important to note that this is the last election where we see two major parties. Remember, we discussed how the Civil War, the years prior to the Civil War, is the end of the two-party system, or is a temporary suspension of the two-party system. What political party is going to disappear after 1852? And we'll just be left with the Democrats as the single national party until it breaks apart in 1860. What political party is disappearing? The Whigs. Very quick answer. Exactly right. I got to show you guys this political cartoon that Alexis Reese made, comparing the Whigs to a jellyfish. And so, but they could never quite stand firm on the matter of slavery or its expansion. And so the party divides on the issue. And when a party is divided, it loses elections and it becomes obsolete. So 1852, the Whigs are going to take their exit. In the last unit, we talked a lot about manifest destiny, right? The notion that the Western Hemisphere is destined to be controlled by one power, one global power, the United States of America. And we saw how that impacted our interaction with Mexico. That hasn't ended. I mean, the Mexican War has ended, but this attitude of the right to control the Western Hemisphere hasn't ended, right? This continues on. Just talked about how hundreds of thousands of immigrants are moving into the United States, most of them in the north. But because of the way the map looks, the country is running out of territory where Southerners can expand their agenda and expand their political influence and maintain sectional balance. So the primary objective of manifest destiny, at least in Southerners' eyes, was to control what modern day nations. Now, these were not nations at the time, but what territory. Southerners start to look at what places as perhaps the next territory the United States could acquire. Think south, really south. Yes, Cuba and Latin America in general. We know that the United States government is going to strike up a diplomatic agreement with New Granada, which is today Colombia, and start to try to develop the area today known as Panama, but that they have to compete with Britain, who has influence in what today is modern-day Nicaragua, and the race to build a canal or some kind of transcontinental system that would connect the Pacific and Atlantic is an issue. We will come back to that at the end of the 19th century, but I am referring to Cuba. There's a big push by Southerners to purchase Cuba, and we know that both President Polk tried to purchase it for $10 million, and the Spanish, who control the island, say no. And then President Pierce is planning to purchase Cuba, or tries to purchase Cuba, for $15 million. Northerners discover that, and they're not having any of that. And so that idea is shut down very quickly. But Latin America is the new frontier, or the intended frontier, of Southerners in manifest destiny. And because California becomes a free state, it's very frustrating to Southerners to see their attempts to add additional territory be nixed by this overly powerful union. And this all just goes to show the Civil War isn't solely about slavery. Okay. We also are developing our international presence. Now that California is a state, we are a Pacific power as well. Our first diplomatic engagement with the East, the Far East, think China, takes place in 1844. That again is President Polk. And we establish the Treaty of Wanghia, and the United States becomes a favored nation with the Kingdom of China. And China is happy to make that relationship because it had been fighting with the British in the Opium Wars and wants to stick it to them and develop some good relationship with other Western nations. So Treaty of Wanghia there. Okay, so who is the admiral of the U.S. Navy that sails his big steamships into the port of Tokyo in 1853 to impress the Japanese and try to coax them out of their isolation? And these are kind of side notes right now, but down the road, as we get into World War II, we're going to want to be looking at what the relationship between the United States and the Far East are. Yep. Admiral Perry. Yes, Commodore Perry. Matthew Perry, not to be confused with the actor on Friends. Okay. My wife just called me a dork. Not a surprise. Easiest answer of the night. The railroad is going to become instrumental in this particular time. It's going to be the device that many suggest will keep the East and the West tied together. The amount of time it takes to travel about 5,000 miles from coast to coast is almost, it's prohibitive. It could lead to two separate nations. And so a railroad needs to develop. As I had mentioned, there was consideration of putting one down in Nicaragua, first transcontinental railroad, but that's not what we think of when we think of the transcontinental railroad. The first proposal for a transcontinental railroad in the United States was suggested to be in what section of the country? So you got three options: north, center, or southern part of the country. Now think carefully. The first proposal. Then we're going to get Stephen Douglas to come along and suggest a different plan. That's where it settled. Claire says the Midwest. That's ultimately where it did develop. Okay. Starting, Stephen Douglas pushes for the Midwest, through the middle of the United States. But the original transcontinental railroad proposal would have put it in the South, from Texas through the southwestern territory of New Mexico. Remember, we get the Gadsden Purchase, which finishes out the border along the Southwest, because that would provide a smooth plane for the railroad to travel. It would avoid some mountains down there. And then the western terminus of that railroad would have been Los Angeles. Instead, Stephen Douglas steps up to the plate and proposes that a railroad ought to go through the center of the country. That this would be this action would be unifying for the country, and not because it would be more affordable or practical. It's got to run through the Rocky Mountains. But what were some of the reasons that have been speculated for Douglas's interest in making the railroad more of a northern or centralized feature? And then let's also remember, before that can happen, we're going to have to get both sections on board. Right. Connor says Douglas owned property in Chicago. Actually, what you mean is he owns stock in a Chicago railroad company. That's one option. Yeah. He also had political ambition and speculated that he was eyeing a presidential run in 1856. So it's not so much about his deep concern about solving sectional interests or bringing about an end to slavery, but his whole thing I think your book is suggesting that he was a bit of an egotist in serving himself. But okay, but before this can happen, before Douglas's plan to move a railroad northward into free soil can take place, you got to get the South on board. So what set of compromises does Stephen Douglas propose? What's the name for the compromise that Stephen Douglas proposes that would open up the whole sectional can of worms again? The Kansas-Nebraska Act is absolutely correct. Okay? Yes. Now, what is the Kansas-Nebraska Act going to do? Okay? Remember, he's a big supporter of popular sovereignty. Okay? He's the popular sovereignty guy. What does the Kansas-Nebraska Act propose? Yes, to open up Kansas and Nebraska to decide the slavery question based on popular sovereignty. You know, I thought we had this solved, right? I thought in 1850 we had a plan. Well, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to invalidate the Compromise of 1850. Okay. Right. It's going to break the Missouri Compromise. It's going to break the Compromise of 1850. But just to be fair, Claire, the Missouri Compromise has already ended, right? The Compromise of 1850 did that. You got to think chronologically. Missouri is first. That's repealed by 1850. 1850 is repealed by Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, here's the $1 million question. What decision is going to invalidate all of them? Okay, so we keep this sectional balance trying to maintain northern states as free, southern states as slave. What decision is going to invalidate this idea that you can limit where slavery expands. It's going to be another big step towards civil war. I'll give you a hint. It's not going to be a legislative action that invalidates all three of them. So it's not going to come from the legislature. So it either has to come from the president or the courts. Nope. Creating constitutions is a legislative action. I'm kind of jumping back and forth here just to try to tell the story of history here. But the Lecompton Constitution, that's going to, and let's mention that here for a second while everybody else digests that previous question. The Lecompton Constitution is going to be an effort to solve the voter fraud and the tension that's taking place in Kansas itself. Okay. Douglas proposes popular sovereignty decides the issue of slavery in Kansas. Well, we know thousands of Missourians pile over into Kansas and vote to make it a slave state. Abolitionists get frustrated and they set up their own government in Topeka. So we've got a standoff. We've got two state capitals in Kansas, and we're no closer to solving this issue. There's violence breaking out in Bleeding, Kansas, where militias of free soilers and slaveryites are fighting one another. We get crazy old John Brown in there. The Lecompton Constitution is an effort to restore peace, and here's how. Okay, I'll forego my questions on the Lecompton Constitution, but here's how it does. Okay, it's going to allow the citizens through popular sovereignty to vote again on whether they support slavery or freedom. But regardless of the outcome, present slave owners in Kansas will be able to keep their slaves. Okay, that's going to upset Northerners because that's not true popular sovereignty, and it's not going to allow them to create a new free state. And it's not going to. It's more or less a bone thrown to slave interests. Regardless of the outcome, there will be slavery in Kansas. That's Lecompton. So back to the original question, what decision, and it's not something legislative, so it's either got to be executive or judicial, comes down the line that invalidates all previous legislative agreements on slavery. Invalidates means gets rid of them. The answer rests in the simulation that we did together in class. It's the Dred Scott decision. Okay, Dred Scott decision is going to rule that it's unconstitutional to deny a person person being a white person, their rights to property without due process of law, which in effect protects slavery in all territory of the United States, right? A person with slaves being property, is entitled by the constitutional right to take that property wherever they go. And so the decision that invalidates all previous legislative action is Dred Scott. And of course, the consequence, just as before, Northerners are going to see this as a huge infringement on their state rights. Hopefully you're having one of those, oh yeah, moments. Hopefully that makes sense to you now. Otherwise, don't beat yourself up with like a cane, because my next question is about the caning of Charles Sumner. Okay. Why or what value is there in the story of Charles Sumner being beaten by Preston Brooks? Why, other than just a really weird and cruel and yet interesting story, what value or what does this event point to? 1856, the caning of Charles Sumner. And that may take a little explanation, but I want to see if you can identify what its value is. Okay, you have the facts correct, Claire, but that doesn't point to the big significance of it. As far as what does it demonstrate about the nation that Brooks beats the snot out of Sumner? Yeah, Connor. It just demonstrates how tense, divided, and uncompromising both sides have become. Okay. The time for compromise seems to be at an end. And now we have our nation's leaders not behaving as Henry Clay or Daniel Webster did, where trying to find concessions, but instead just beating the bloody snot out of one another in the most important or prestigious lawmaking body of the nation. Okay. A few more questions about Dred Scott then. Hopefully we understand that it protects the interests of slaveholders based on their rights to property. It's also going to identify Dred Scott as property, which means he doesn't have a right to a court case, right? And it's going to open up the nation to slavery because slaveholders can't be denied their rights. I think that pretty much covers Dred Scott. Any questions about that, just shoot me a message in the chat. The next big thing I want to look at here is the election of Abraham Lincoln and the final secession of the South. Tell me about Lincoln's political views on slavery. As he's a candidate, as he runs for Senate in 1858, and as he runs for president in 1860, politically, how does he see his ability to address slavery? Doesn't think he has the ability to change or address slavery is absolutely correct. He tries to console. Console is not the right word, but he tries to really calm the nation's fears, or at least the South's fears, that he would abolish slavery, that he's a radical abolitionist, by saying, look, the president, Congress, constitutionally cannot impact slavery where it already exists. That's a 10th Amendment states' rights issue. But he is a free soiler, right? His effort, his intention as a candidate is to limit the expansion of slavery into new territories. And as a consequence of that, when he's president-elect, he indicates that he would not support the Crittenden Compromise, right? The Crittenden Compromise recommends a constitutional amendment to permanently prevent slavery's expansion, permanently establish slavery south of the Missouri line, okay, without ability to repeal or amend that particular change to the Constitution. So Lincoln indicates he would not support the Crittenden Compromise, and that's pretty much dead in the water. All right. So South Carolina secedes from the Union a couple days after the election of Abraham Lincoln. What's their rationale? Are they just crazy? Are they just, evil? No, of course not. How do they justify? How do they rationalize? Think about using the American Revolution. How do they rationalize their act of secession? Okay. Ariana is referencing compact theory, and that is part of it, that the Union was created from a series of voluntary states, so they should be able to leave voluntarily. But I'm thinking more about the Declaration of Independence and the mission of the American Revolution, and how the South sees its mission or its objectives, its purpose for leaving the Union as Abraham Lincoln takes office. Okay. What was the mission or objective? And I realize independence, but independence from what? And don't say Great Britain. Okay. But the whole purpose, the reason for independence from Great Britain versus this whole reason for independence from the Union. Think about that a little bit. And then also, I would like to know, just as kind of a factoid here, what the first outbreak, what was the battle, the first outbreak of warfare between Union forces and Confederate forces that really shocks the North, makes it real, and leads them to take a hostile stance towards the Confederacy, because until that point, most Northerners would have been content to see the South leave peacefully. Sorry, throwing two questions out at you at once, but just for the sake of time, as some of you look at one question, maybe some of you could look at the second. Ariana says the first battle was Battle of Bull Run. That's the first full-scale battle, okay? The outbreak of war takes place at a different battle before that. Yeah, the first Battle of Bull Run we need to remember because it's the first full-scale conflict. The first official battle, no one dies. Okay, Battle of Bull Run, though, quite a different story. That's full scale, but Confederate forces open up an attack on an American military base where? Fort Sumter is right. Okay. Yep, Fort Sumter. Until Fort Sumter, most Americans would have been content to see the South go its separate way peacefully. Remember, President Buchanan indicated that while he thought it was illegal, he didn't think there was really anything the United States could do if Southern states left. And even though there's, kind of this chaos that follows secession, like who's going to control military forts like Fort Sumter, until the South opens up on Fort Sumter, it really isn't real. And the 32-hour bombardment of Fort Sumter makes it real, makes Northerners recognize that there's a full-blown rebellion taking place, and as a consequence, 75,000 men sign up for the Union Army. President Lincoln is going to instill a blockade, right? A naval blockade that's going to cut off Southern commerce. He's going to send out massive amounts of troops out west to Missouri to try to hold that particular state. He's going to institute martial law in Maryland, because Maryland and Delaware, these border states, are, prone to following in South Carolina's footsteps. And so the war becomes real with Fort Sumter. We get, with the election of Abraham Lincoln, we have 7 states secede between his election and the failure of the Crittenden Compromise. But then those last 4 border states are going to secede in following Fort Sumter, and Lincoln needs to do something to keep other border states from leaving. Okay. Not that we usually think of Lincoln in that way, but that demonstrates just the level of power, the level of control he exercised as commander-in-chief. Some of the things he did, comparatively to other presidents, make him one of the most authoritarian presidents we've had in history. What advantages? Let's identify three advantages the Confederacy has going into war. Okay, let's start with that one. Ariana says home court advantage. Now we're dealing with a divided United States. Why are you implying, Ariana, that the war will have to come to the South? Okay. Connor's helping you out. I know Ariana probably just went like this, like, oh, they can fight a defensive battle, even though they're outnumbered. In order to effectively rebel, an area just a place in rebellion only has to wear out its opponent. Get the United States to give up, wait for popular opinion to turn against President Lincoln, and they gain their independence. So home field advantage, as far as you can wait for the Union Army to invade, hold defensive position, wear them down, and hopefully they'll go home. More skilled fighters. Yeah, I mean, country living developed a gun culture in the South that didn't exist in big urban centers of the North. And of course, military leadership in General Lee and other Confederate officers. It should be no surprise then that the one major weakness the Confederacy faces is its economy. Okay, there are others. Its lack of central government is going to leave it disorganized and facing many of the same challenges that the Union faced under the Articles of Confederation. But economics is the biggest thing. The South has one major hope, though, and that's that Britain and France, but Britain especially, will aid the call or heed the call of assistance, because Britain has such an investment in Southern cotton. What little book, though, really turned public opinion in Britain and around the world against American slavery? Don't say the Bible. The Bible probably did more to support slavery or was used in defense of slavery than opposition. Uncle Tom's Cabin is the correct answer. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. We talked pretty extensively about how the economic conditions of the cotton industry didn't make Britain desperate for cotton until the war was almost over, right? And so public opinion and not economic necessity is going to keep Britain out of the war. We talked about the Homestead Act and immigration. Numbers is going to be a major influence in the course of this war. The Union, the word in and of itself, to be united, to have a strong central government with a capable commander-in-chief like Abraham Lincoln, is going to be an immeasurable advantage for the Union and the North's economy. True or false? The war hurt the North's economy. False. It is false. Yes, there's going to be inflation, right? but the runaway inflation is in the South. 9,000% inflation in the South versus 80%. Yeah, the value of money is depreciating or inflating, but at the same time, that is way outpaced by economic expansion. The war industry creates the first class of millionaires, right? Everything from making uniforms and shoes and producing consumable goods for soldiers. You remember watching America, the Story of Us, and seeing not necessarily an assembly line, but certainly a factory system that's creating cartridges, to the expansion of railroads and telephone communications, and with farming, the McCormick Reaper, and the need for food. All of that is going to benefit the North, while the North effectively cuts off the commerce of the South. So the war will certainly hurt the economy of the South, but it's good times economically for the North. We're almost done. We're almost there. The South controls the war from the outset. Battle of Bull Run 1 is a Confederate victory. It's good for the North in the sense that it makes people recognize this is not going to be a quick and decisive victory for the Union, that they need to prepare for a real war and not just an uprising. But that's a Confederate victory. Bull Run 2 is a Confederate victory. General McClellan is very cautious, always assuming the Confederates have more forces than him. And so his efforts in the Peninsula campaign to try to capture Richmond fall short of the mark, and he's replaced. As we approach the election of 1864, Lincoln is pretty desperate for a victory. He begins to consider the fact that doing something about slavery would be beneficial to the war effort because it would further hurt the economy of the South, but he cannot emancipate slaves without some kind of major victory. What battle? And this will be the exit of General McClellan. Even though he wins the battle, he loses his job because he doesn't pursue Lee. What major battle gives Lincoln the popularity to issue his Emancipation Proclamation? And then the easier question I'll give here on the Emancipation Proclamation is where, be specific, were slaves set free by the Emancipation Proclamation? See, we've got 4 people watching tonight. I've had split screen and looking at my notes and things. Well, I really appreciate that you guys are taking this seriously and that you're doing everything necessary and proper to get the grade that you aspire to get, and I'm sure it will fall for you. It's been a while since we've had a test. I think this will come as a little bit of a wake-up call for some people as we settle back into routine for the second semester. But let me help you with these Emancipation Proclamation questions then. The name of the battle that, hey, Ariana beat me to the punch. Antietam is the correct answer. So Antietam is going to trigger the Emancipation Proclamation. It's going to lose McClellan his job. Probably is going to save Lincoln's job. But it's also going to give Lincoln the popularity then to feel comfortable issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, that document declares slaves where as emancipated? And please don't just say the South. In places that are still in rebellion. So not Missouri, not Kentucky, not Maryland or Delaware or West Virginia or any territory that was supportive of the Union or under control of the Union military, but in places that were in rebellion, slavery was abolished. So in effect, from a legal standpoint, it only addresses the places that don't recognize Lincoln's authority. So one could argue it actually doesn't have a legal influence or legal merit in the places that Lincoln intends to address. And the places that he does have the authority to address, he doesn't act on it. So what is going to be the thing that permanently abolishes slavery nationwide? Okay. What action is going to be taken, or what legislative, I'm trying to not give away the answer. What's going to have to happen before slavery is permanently abolished in the Union? That's right. 13th Amendment. Very good. JD, hey. 13th Amendment is the correct answer. That will abolish slavery in all states. We have to remember that Lincoln saw the Emancipation Proclamation as a wartime measure. He was very concerned about what would take place once peace was restored. There's discussion about a peace delegation from the South, and this delegation is trying to make an effort to negotiate with him, and he puts them on a boat in the harbor on the Potomac River in basically the no man's land, and prevents them from getting into the city limits of Washington, D.C., so that Congress can hurry up and propose the 13th Amendment. At one time, Congress stops its business to ask the president, is it true that a peace delegation is in the works, that there's a peace delegation? And Lincoln, always the master of words, sends back a message to Congress that says, there is no peace delegation in the city that I know of. And so it's technically true. There's no peace delegation in the city limits that Lincoln knows of. And so they push the recommendation of the 13th Amendment through so that it can go out to the states to be ratified. But that is an event that takes place a very short time before the assassination of the president. And we've got two more little details to look at here, and then we'll call it a night. The Battle of Gettysburg. Obviously, we have the Gettysburg Address, where the president issues his statement of the values, the core purpose of the war. And if you haven't read it, you should. But as far as a historic marker, why is the Gettysburg or the Battle of Gettysburg important? Okay. What was the objective of General Lee in marching into Pennsylvania? And then somebody else can take my last question, which is, what strategy did General Sherman employ in the South to break the morale of the Southern people? And then we get great movies like Gone with the Wind. So why was Gettysburg significant, and what was General Sherman's strategy in the South? Only 45 questions on tomorrow's test. I tried to keep it to the core of what we covered in class, the core of the history that advances us as far as not just now here in the Civil War, but stuff that we're going to want to be able to use down the road as we look at history across time. So 45 questions. Tonight, we've, I think, done a pretty good job of covering the essentials of those questions. All right. Well, the Battle of Gettysburg is considered the high watermark of the Confederacy. Okay. It is an effort by Lee to put pressure on Washington, D.C., and put pressure on the American people to seek peace terms. You know, an invasion, as the people of the South are experiencing with General Sherman, is an effective political tool as well as military tool, because people are going to want to seek peace, especially those in the wake of the devastation. And so Lee intends to march up and around and attack DC from the north. And he is met in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, by General Meade. And this epic 3-day battle takes place. And at one point, there's a Confederate general by the name of Pickett that leads a charge across an open battlefield, an open wheat field, and they're just mowed down by the dozens. They get to basically the foot of a hill and ultimately have to retreat. But the exact mark where Pickett's charge ends is the furthest northward the Confederate Army gets. And then it's a slow retreat back south. and the Union picks up momentum following the Battle of Gettysburg. The Gettysburg Address, this short but just unparalleled speech by President Lincoln, defines the importance and the value of this major conflict. And it seems like the tide has changed, and that victory for the Union and the doom of the South is coming. Okay. As far as Sherman goes, JD's right. Sherman is going to lead a scorched earth tactic across the South, destroying not just military, but also civilian objectives to try to push the Southern people to call for peace as well. So it's strange to think of it, but that kind of warfare, the use of that against the American people is how Southerners view Lincoln. And there are still some people today that identify with the Confederate cause and will not say glowing things about President Lincoln because of the treatment of people in the Confederacy during the course of this war. All right, my voice is shot. I hope I've given you a good overview here. If you have any questions, I'll take those now. All right. I hope this has been beneficial, whether you're watching it live or whether you're tuning in to catch it as a recording. Best of luck. Keep being diligent, awesome, inspiring students. Have a good night.